Have you ever looked your boss dead in the eye, listening to the threats spilling from his mouth, and realized he had no idea he was digging his own grave? If you have ever been exploited and pushed to the absolute edge, stick around. What started as a closed-door demand to slash my salary ended with a labor board raid, a settlement of $400,000, and an abusive manager being escorted out by security. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing these stories to life for you. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment. My name is Peyton Reyes, and I am 32 years old. At the time of this nightmare, I was working as an operations manager at Ethelgard Logistics Tech, a mid-sized freight startup located in the sweltering, traffic-choked heart of Austin, Texas. If you have ever spent time in the logistics industry, you know it is less of a business and more of a daily exercise in surviving chaos. I was the person keeping that chaotic machine from entirely burning down. I was the sole architect carrying the weight of our entire dispatch system. I wrangled the routes, balanced the driver schedules, and put out the fires before the executives even smelled smoke. Despite this, I was practically invisible. The higher-ups preferred it that way. I was just the quiet, reliable engine humming in the background while they paraded around claiming to be tech visionaries. Then, the company hired Marcus Vance. Marcus was our newly appointed regional director, and he was the absolute embodiment of modern toxic corporate culture. He strutted around the open-plan office in tailored suits that cost more than my monthly rent, flashing a blindingly white, predatory smile. He communicated almost entirely in empty corporate jargon. Every conversation with him involved phrases like disruptive thinking, synergizing paradigms, and shifting the operational landscape. But behind that polished, superficial exterior, Marcus was a ruthless manipulator. He possessed absolutely zero operational skills, yet he had an incredible talent for stealing the intellectual property of his subordinates and presenting it to the board as his own genius. To Marcus, employees were not human beings. We were just numbers on a spreadsheet, resources meant to be squeezed dry and thrown away. To make my daily life even more unbearable, Marcus brought in a junior associate named Tyler. Tyler was the nephew of one major company shareholder. He was a textbook nepotism hire. Tyler spent roughly 90% of his workday leaning back in his expensive ergonomic chair, scrolling mindlessly through social media, entirely oblivious to the frantic pace of the office. The remaining 10% of his time was dedicated to actively destroying the delicate dispatch schedules I had built. Because of Tyler, dozens of our contract drivers would be sent to the wrong loading docks, or loads would be double booked. I was the one forced to scramble, apologize to angry truckers, and manually fix the messes while Tyler watched viral videos. Marcus never once reprimanded him. Instead, he treated Tyler like a prodigy, constantly praising his fresh perspective. The breaking point finally arrived on a late Friday afternoon. Tyler, in a rare moment of actually attempting to do his job, managed to completely crash the central routing server. The system went totally dark. Dozens of trucks were left stranded on the highways, rather than helping. Tyler simply packed his gym bag, offered a half-hearted apology, and left for a weekend trip to the lake. I was left behind. I stayed in that glowing, empty, and suffocatingly quiet office all through Friday night. I drank terrible cold coffee and manually rebuilt the routing databases line by line, sacrificing my entire weekend to save the company from a massive logistical disaster. It was around 3 in the morning when I found the skeletons in the closet. While digging deep into the administrative backend to restore the driver logs, I noticed a glaring discrepancy. Thousands of driver overtime hours from the past 2 quarters had been manually wiped out. Drivers who had logged grueling 60-hour weeks in the sweltering heat were magically knocked down to 40 hours in the payroll system. I traced the digital footprints, The user ID belonged to Marcus. He had been quietly deleting their hard-earned overtime hours to artificially lower his regional operational costs. By making his budget look incredibly lean, he was securing massive performance bonuses for himself. My blood ran cold in that empty office. This was not just bad management, it was systemic wage theft. I kept quiet for the rest of the weekend, naively planning to bring this undeniable data to the Human Resources Department on Monday morning. But Marcus struck first, bright and early Monday. He called a mandatory all-hands meeting. I walked into the glass-walled conference room, physically exhausted but expecting, at the very least, a brief thank you for fixing the server. Instead, Marcus stood at the head of the table, pointed his finger directly at me, and launched into a vicious public execution. He never mentioned the server crash. He never mentioned Tyler's incompetence. Instead, he loudly accused me of overstepping my operational authority. He claimed I was a rogue employee recklessly digging into restricted financial data files. I sat there, completely stunned, as my coworkers stared at me in awkward, suffocating silence. Then, he delivered the ultimate twist. He flipped the entire narrative, accusing me of causing a potential internal data leak. "This company thrives on absolute trust. Peyton," he announced, his voice dripping with theatrical disappointment. "You violated that trust. To atone for this massive breach of protocol, and to prove your loyalty to this company, you will be taking on all weekend dispatch audits for the foreseeable future. That is at least 20 extra hours a week, unpaid. If you cannot demonstrate your commitment to our culture, we will have to reevaluate your future employment here." The ping of the internal messaging system cut through the dull hum of the office. It was a direct message from Marcus. My office, now, no pleasantries, no context, just a digital command dragging me toward the center of the floor. Marcus occupied the only fully enclosed workspace in the building. It was a completely transparent glass cube, heavily soundproofed, positioned right in the middle of the open floor plan like a terrarium for a predator. You could see everything happening inside, but you could not hear a single whisper. It was his favorite interrogation room. He loved the psychological terror it inflicted on the staff. He could scream, berate, and threaten you. And while the entire company could watch your face crumble, no one could actually hear the abuse. It left 0 witnesses and 0 acoustic evidence. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but the panic from the morning meeting had already burned away, leaving behind a sharp, icy clarity. I knew exactly what this meeting was going to be. He needed to silence me, to put me back in my place after my weekend discovery. As I walked down the aisle between the rows of desks, I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. My hands were trembling slightly, but I forced my breathing to slow down. Just before my hand touched the heavy aluminum handle of his door, I subtly brushed my right index finger over the face of my smartwatch. With 2 quick, practiced taps, I launched the hidden voice recording application. A tiny red microphone icon blinked once on the screen before I quickly pulled my cardigan sleeve down to conceal it. I took one final, deep breath, pushed the heavy glass door open, and stepped into the vacuum. The silence inside was immediate and suffocating. The chaotic noise of ringing phones and typing keyboards from the main floor vanished the second the door clicked shut behind me. Marcus was leaning back in his leather executive chair, his fingers steepled together. He did not ask me to sit. I stood there, feeling the collective gaze of 50 coworkers burning into my back through the glass walls. He casually reached into his desk drawer and tossed a thick stack of stapled papers across the polished mahogany surface. They slid and stopped right at the edge of the desk. "Sit down and read it," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, knowing perfectly well that the soundproofing would trap every syllable. I sank into the stiff guest chair and picked up the document. It was a completely new employment contract. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, and my heart slammed against my ribs. He was not just punishing me, he was legally binding my hands and feet. The contract explicitly stated a 30% reduction in my annual salary. Furthermore, my title was being officially stripped from operations manager down to operations assistant. But the most horrifying part was the final page. It was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. The terms were completely unhinged. If I signed it, I would be legally forbidden from discussing anything regarding Ethelgard's financial logs, routing metrics, or driver compensation with anyone, ever. I do not understand, I said, keeping my voice intentionally small and shaky, playing the part of the terrified subordinate he wanted to see. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. It is very simple. Peyton, you poked your nose into places it did not belong. You are a liability, but I am a generous man. I am giving you a chance to stay employed. You sign that paper right now. You accept your new role, and you keep your head down. I swallowed hard, looking at the 30% pay cut. I cannot survive on this salary. Marcus, I have rent. I have bills. His polished smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated malice. Then leave. Walk out that door. I will fire you on the spot for gross insubordination and suspected corporate espionage. And let me be absolutely clear about what happens next. I know every regional director at every logistics tech startup in Texas. I play golf with the venture capitalists who fund them. If you refuse to sign this and try to walk away, I will personally ensure you are blackballed. I will drag your name through the mud so thoroughly that you will not be able to get a job managing a fast food drive-thru in the entire state. He let the threat hang heavily in the dead air of the soundproof room. He felt invincible. He was sitting in his literal glass castle, holding all the cards, completely unaware of the digital watch recording every breath he took. His arrogance swelled, pushing him to cross the final, fatal line. You think you are some kind of hero for looking at those driver logs? Marcus sneered, letting out a dark, condescending chuckle. You think you uncovered the crime of the century I wiped those hours? Of course I did. Those contract drivers are entirely expendable. They are uneducated laborers who do not even read their own pay stubs. I need to keep regional overhead low. And if skimming a few hours off the top of their overtime gets me my end-of-year bonus, then that is exactly what I'm going to do. That is how the world works. Peyton, the weak pay for the strong. You better keep your mouth shut and learn your place. There it was, the golden ticket, the undeniable, voluntary confession to systemic wage theft and corporate fraud, delivered straight from his own mouth. My chest tightened, but I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw the papers back in his face or tell him he was a monster. I knew that the slightest display of defiance would make him suspicious. I needed him to believe he had completely broken my spirit. I forced a look of utter defeat onto my face. I slumped my shoulders, stared blankly at the floor, and let out a shaky sigh. I understand, I whispered, my voice perfectly conveying a broken woman. I am sorry. Marcus, I really am. I just need a little time. Please, give me 24 hours to figure out my budget before I sign it. I will bring it back to you first thing tomorrow morning. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He had won. He had crushed the rebellion. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp, or security packs your box, he replied dismissively, waving his hand toward the door. I nodded meekly, gathered the heavy stack of papers, and walked out of the glass cage. The loud, chaotic noise of the office washed over me the second I opened the door, but I barely registered it. Underneath the sleeve of my cardigan, the little red microphone icon was still blinking. I walked straight to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and stopped the recording. I hit save. I now possessed exactly 12 minutes of crystal clear, high-definition audio. There was no background noise, no static, just the crisp, undeniable sound of Marcus Vance ending his own career. I walked back to my desk, the heavy weight of the recording resting on my wrist. Most people in my position would have gone home, cried into a glass of wine, and frantically updated their resumes. I did not. I sat down, flexed my fingers, and opened a sterile black terminal window on my second monitor. To properly nail him to the wall, an audio confession was fantastic, but raw data was undeniable. I needed the server logs. Now, Standard operational managers do not have access to the deep back-end architecture, but Tyler, in his infinite laziness, had never bothered to revoke the root administrative privileges I used during the Friday night server crash. He had simply left the master keys hanging in the lock. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing lines of query code. I bypassed the standard user interface and dove straight into the raw database. I initiated a silent, compressed download of the entire editing history for the dispatch server. My heart beat against my ribs like a trapped bird as I watched the progress bar slowly fill. 90%, 95%, complete. I dragged the encrypted zip file onto a secure thumb drive, pulled it from the port, and dropped it into my purse. That night, my living room transformed into a war room. I brewed a pot of incredibly strong coffee, hooked my personal laptop up to 2 external monitors, and started mining the data. What I found made the wage theft look like a misdemeanor. Marcus was not just skimming hours to manipulate his budget. He was running a massive, systematic embezzlement scheme. By cross-referencing the driver payment logs with the active dispatch routes, I uncovered a network of ghost contractors. There were over a dozen profiles in the system with fabricated commercial driver license numbers. These phantom drivers never took a single load, yet they were consistently logging 40-hour work weeks. The payroll system was automatically routing their weekly checks into a series of obscure shell company bank accounts. I traced the creation of the first fake profile. It dated back exactly 2 years, perfectly coinciding with Marcus arriving for his first week on the job. He was bleeding the company dry from the inside out. But raw data can sometimes be explained away as a system glitch by a clever lawyer. I needed to establish a behavioral pattern. I needed witnesses. Using my personal phone, I sent encrypted messages to 3 former operations employees who had abruptly quit within the last 18 months. At first, they were terrified to speak with me. Marcus had threatened them with the exact same industry blacklisting he had used on me. But once I told them I had a loaded gun pointed directly at his career, the floodgates opened. Within 3 hours, my inbox was filled with screenshots of unhinged, late-night text messages from Marcus, frantic emails demanding they alter financial reports, and proof of his relentless psychological abuse. By Tuesday morning, I had compiled a devastating, bulletproof dossier. I printed everything out and placed it in a crisp manila folder. My initial plan was to march straight into the Regional Human Resources Department and drop the bomb on the director's desk. But as I sat in the parking lot, my intuition screamed at me to double-check my surroundings. I opened my phone and did a deep dive into the Human Resources Director's background. It took me 15 minutes of scrolling through obscure public records and old social media posts to find the fatal connection. The director's maiden name was Vance. She was his first cousin. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. If I had walked into that office and handed her the folder, she would have shredded the evidence before I even reached my car. I would have been immediately terminated, sued for corporate espionage, and ruined. The entire regional office was a rigged game. I threw the internal company handbook into the passenger seat. If the house was entirely corrupt, I had to burn it down from the outside. I drove to an electronics store and purchased a heavy-duty external hard drive with cache. I loaded the 12-minute audio file, the exported server logs, the IP addresses of the ghost accounts, and the witness testimonies onto the drive. I applied military-grade encryption to the entire volume. Then, I drafted a meticulously detailed, anonymous whistleblower complaint. I drove to a post office 2 towns over to avoid any local security cameras. I packaged the drive and the printed dossier, paid for certified overnight shipping, and mailed it directly to the investigative branch of the Texas Workforce Commission and the Federal Department of Labor. The missile had been launched. Now, I just had to survive the wait. I drove back to the office, walked straight up to Marcus, and handed him the new, degrading employment contract. I had signed it in blue ink. "I made my budget work," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, perfectly mimicking a shattered, defeated woman. "Thank you for the opportunity to stay." Marcus snatched the paper from my hand, a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction washing over his face. "Good girl. I knew you would see reason. Now get back to your desk and fetch me the quarterly projections." "Yes, Marcus," I replied softly. And so began my campaign of malicious compliance. For the next several days, I became the absolute perfect, mindless drone. I did exactly what he asked, when he asked, without a single word of pushback. I let him insult me. I let him pile Tyler's unfinished work onto my desk. I nodded obediently while he paraded around the office, utterly convinced he had crushed my spirit and solidified his empire. He was so blinded by his own toxic ego that he never even noticed the invisible noose I had carefully wrapped around his neck. He had absolutely no idea the countdown clock had already started. Marcus reveled in his supposed victory, having forced me into that humiliating contract. He assumed I was completely broken. To him, I was a tamed animal, but he was not satisfied with just subjugating me. He wanted to build an ironclad paper trail to eventually terminate me with cause. He began assigning me the most mind-numbing, redundant tasks imaginable. I was told to manually cross-reference paper shipping manifests from 3 years ago, a task that had been entirely digitized before I even joined the company. Then came the emails. My inbox would ping at 2 in the morning with urgent, convoluted requests about minor routing errors. If I did not respond by 6 in the morning, he would send a follow-up reprimanding my lack of dedication and urgency. He was desperately trying to create documented evidence of my alleged incompetence. My response was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. I replied to every single ridiculous midnight email at exactly 6 in the morning, executing his requests with robotic perfection. I attached PDF copies of the official employee handbook to my replies, highlighting the specific corporate clauses justifying my exact workflow. Furthermore, I blindly copied my personal email address on every single response, securely archiving his harassment without his knowledge. My overly cheerful, meticulously polite replies infuriated him. I was giving him exactly what he asked for, leaving him absolutely zero ammunition to write me up. Watching his face turn a blotchy red through the glass of his office as he read, my flawless morning reports became the sole highlight of my workday. The illusion of his control shattered completely on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. You could actually feel the atmospheric pressure in the open-plan office drop. I watched from my desk as the human resources director, Marcus's cousin, sprinted out of her office looking like she had just seen a ghost. She was clutching a stack of papers, her hands trembling so violently that they rustled loud enough for the nearest cubicles to hear. A preliminary subpoena and a formal request for information had just been delivered from the Texas Workforce Commission directly to the corporate headquarters in New York, who then immediately flagged the Austin branch. The government was asking highly specific questions regarding missing driver compensation and unrecognized vendor accounts. Local human resources was in absolute, chaotic panic mode. They knew someone had blown the whistle, but because my complaint was meticulously anonymized, they had no idea who was holding the match. Marcus, however, possessed just enough paranoid instinct to connect the dots. The timing was too coincidental. He marched out of his glass office, his face contorted in a mask of absolute fury. He bypassed the empty cubicles and stormed directly toward my desk. He did not care that we were on the open floor. He did not care about the optics. He slammed both of his heavy fists down on my desk so hard that the impact shook the partitions, and my hot coffee spilled completely across my keyboard. "You," he hissed, his voice a venomous growl that carried across the silent room. "You think you are so smart. Do you not? You think you can play games with me. I know exactly what you did." I slowly pulled a tissue from the box and began dabbing the spilled coffee. I said nothing. "I am going to crush you," he roared, leaning over my monitor, spittle flying from his lips. "I am going to grind you into absolute dust. By the time I am finished with you, you will be begging to clean toilets. You are nothing. You are a miserable, pathetic little rat. And I am going to destroy your entire life." I finished wiping up the spill, tossed the wet tissue into the trash can, and finally looked up at him. I did not cower. I did not tremble. For the first time in weeks, I allowed a genuine, radiant smile to spread across my face. "Marcus," I said gently, my voice entirely calm and conversational, "are you absolutely sure you want to continue this conversation?" He blinked, momentarily thrown off by my total lack of fear. "What did you just say to me?" Without breaking eye contact, I raised my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the ceiling corner directly above my cubicle. Up there, a black, dome-shaped security camera was blinking with a steady red light. "I submitted an internal IT support ticket yesterday afternoon," I explained cheerfully. "I noticed that camera had a severe blind spot, so they kindly adjusted the angle. It now has a perfect, unobstructed view of my desk, and my face, and your face." Marcus froze, his eyes darting up to the lens, his face drained of color. But the trap was not finished snapping shut. I reached out and tapped the glowing green screen of my desktop phone. I had intentionally engaged the speakerphone feature before he even reached my desk. The call duration timer read precisely 3 minutes and 45 seconds. "Oh, and one more thing," I added, projecting my voice clearly toward the microphone. "Marcus, I would like to formally introduce you to the senior legal compliance team at our New York corporate headquarters. I called their internal ethics hotline the moment I saw you storming out of your office. They have been listening to every single word of your little speech." A crisp, authoritative voice echoed from the small speaker on my desk. "Mr. Vance, this is Richard Hayes, Senior Corporate Counsel. We demand you step away from that desk immediately." The absolute silence that followed the corporate lawyer's command over my speakerphone on Wednesday was merely the receding tide before the tsunami. The real destruction made landfall at exactly 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. The heavy glass security doors at the front of the Eithilgard regional office swung violently open, and a severe, unsmiling procession marched straight onto the operational floor. This was not a routine audit. This was a full-scale tactical strike. The delegation was comprised of heavily credentialed inspectors from the Texas Workforce Commission, 2 union attorneys representing the commercial freight drivers, and a team of senior legal compliance officers who had taken the first available red-eye flight from corporate headquarters in New York. Within 60 seconds, the entire building was completely locked down. The corporate IT division had remotely triggered a total network freeze. Every single monitor on the floor instantly flashed to a blue administrative lock screen. Keyboards became useless blocks of plastic. Panic rippled through the cubicles. But nobody panicked harder than Marcus. The polished, arrogant predator from the day before completely vanished. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. Desperate to save his sinking ship, he immediately tried to steer the torpedo toward me. As the lead investigator approached, Marcus frantically pointed his finger in my direction, his voice cracking with hysteria. He loudly declared that I was a mentally unstable saboteur, a rogue employee who had maliciously tampered with the financial servers to destroy his pristine reputation. The lead corporate attorney, Richard Hayes, simply ignored the frantic shouting. He instructed Marcus, myself, the regional human resources director, and Tyler to step inside the soundproof glass conference room. The very same glass terrarium where Marcus had tried to end my career was now serving as his execution chamber. The entire office watched through the transparent walls as we took our seats. Marcus continued his pathetic, desperate monologue, begging the executives to believe that I had single-handedly orchestrated the missing funds to frame him. I let him talk. I let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. When he finally ran out of breath, Richard Hayes turned his steely gaze toward me and asked if I had anything to say regarding the allegations. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy-duty encrypted flash drive, and slid it across the sleek mahogany table. On this drive, you will find the complete, unedited server logs detailing every single manual alteration to the driver payment schedules over the past 24 months, I stated calmly, looking directly into Marcus's terrified eyes. You will also find the IP logs linking the administrator account to a network of ghost contractor profiles. But most importantly, you will find a 12-minute audio recording from Tuesday morning. I gestured to the laptop sitting in front of the state inspector. He plugged the drive in, bypassed the encryption with the password I provided, and clicked on the primary audio file. The soundproof room amplified every single syllable. The crystal-clear recording of Marcus's voice echoed off the glass walls. Everyone in the room listened to him threaten to blackball me across the state of Texas. They listened to him aggressively enforce a 30% pay cut. And then, the killing blow landed. His smug, recorded voice confidently admitted to wiping the overtime hours of the drivers. Those contract drivers are entirely expendable. The weak pay for the strong. You better keep your mouth shut and learn your place. When the recording clicked off, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. Marcus looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Then, the most spectacular, unpredictable twist occurred. Tyler, the arrogant nepotism hire who had spent months protected by Marcus, completely shattered under the pressure, staring at the furious faces of the federal and state officials. Tyler realized he was sitting in the blast radius of a massive federal fraud investigation. He was absolutely terrified of going to federal prison, without a single ounce of loyalty. Tyler practically leaped out of his chair and betrayed his boss. "I had nothing to do with this," Tyler screamed, his voice pitching upward in pure panic. "He made me do it. Marcus made me log into the back end and route the ghost driver checks to an offshore shell company. I still have the black market bank account numbers. I will give them all to you. Just please do not arrest me." Tyler began frantically rattling off routing numbers and account passwords, completely dismantling the last remaining pillars of Marcus's fraudulent empire in a matter of seconds. In a desperate, flailing attempt at damage control, the human resources director suddenly jumped to her feet. "This recording is a violation of company policy," she shouted. Her face flushed red as she tried to protect her cousin. She did not have consent to record a private meeting. This entire procedure is unauthorized, and I am ordering a halt to this investigation right now. Richard Hayes slowly turned his head to look at her. The expression on his face was absolute, freezing, absolute zero. "You are in no position to order anything," the corporate attorney replied, his voice dangerously low. "We conducted a background check on the flight over here. We know he is your first cousin. We know you systematically buried 3 separate complaints from former operations staff regarding his abusive behavior. You are hereby suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full criminal investigation for corporate complicity and fraud. Give me your security badge and get out of my sight." By late Thursday afternoon, the chief executive officer of the entire corporation had landed in Austin, rushing straight from the airport to our office. The swiftness of his arrival proved exactly how much damage I had inflicted. Within an hour, the grand finale played out on the main floor. 2 massive private security guards flanked Marcus, grabbing him by the arms and physically marching him out of his beloved glass office. He did not go quietly. He kicked, screamed, and hurled pathetic, desperate curses at anyone who made eye contact with him, but not a single person looked away. The dozens of employees who had endured his daily psychological abuse simply stood at their desks, watching with absolute, quiet contempt as the elevator doors closed on his career forever. The financial fallout for the corporation was completely catastrophic. Because of the undeniable evidence I provided, the Texas Workforce Commission hit the parent company with a massive regulatory penalty totaling $400,000. Furthermore, they were legally mandated to issue immediate, comprehensive back pay and severe punitive damages to the dozens of defrauded truck drivers and exploited staff members. The corporate executives were bleeding money, and they were terrified of the public relations nightmare I could cause if I went to the press. Desperate to protect the company's image and keep me completely quiet, the chief executive officer invited me into the executive boardroom the very next morning. He slid a thick, freshly printed contract across the polished table. It was a formal offer to take over Marcus's vacated regional director position. It came with double my original salary and a massive 6-figure retention bonus. He framed it as an apology for the distress I had suffered. I knew exactly what it really was. It was premium hush money. They wanted to buy my silence and keep me trapped in their ecosystem. I looked at the incredible numbers printed on that page, offered him a polite, chilling smile, and pushed the contract right back across the table. I absolutely refused to inherit a throne built on stolen wages and a fundamentally toxic corporate foundation. Instead, I laid out my own non-negotiable terms. I demanded they wire my full, untaxed compensatory settlement directly into my personal checking account by the end of the business day. I also required a flawless, legally binding letter of recommendation signed by the Chief Executive Officer himself, stating my performance was exemplary. Given the tremendous legal leverage I held over their heads, he signed the document without a single moment of hesitation. I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box and walked away from Ethelgard Logistics forever, but my endgame was not quite finished. I took that generous corporate settlement money and immediately hired one of the most aggressive employment law firms in the state of Texas. I retained their top litigators to represent the collective group of defrauded truck drivers in a massive civil lawsuit directed squarely at Marcus. We bypassed the corporate shield and went straight for the illicit shell companies he had created. Over the next year, we stripped his hidden assets to the bone. We forced him into total, humiliating personal bankruptcy. More importantly, we secured a permanent court injunction that banned him from ever holding a managerial position or handling corporate finances in any capacity again. He became the very dust he had once threatened to grind me into. I will never forget the feeling of stepping out of that suffocating glass building for the final time. The harsh, bright Austin sun felt absolutely incredible on my skin. I walked down the street to my favorite independent coffee shop, ordered a large iced coffee, and flipped open my personal laptop. I did not search for any new job listings. Instead, I opened a blank document and began typing out the foundation and business plan for the Reyes Advocacy Group. It would be a specialized consulting firm dedicated entirely to helping bullied employees document, expose, and completely dismantle toxic managers. The corporate game is inherently rigged against the worker, but from that day forward, I was the only one holding the pen, and I was writing my own rules. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the journey we went on today, I have a small favor to ask. Please consider helping our dedicated channel team with just a $1 donation. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code right on your screen, or by using the donation link located in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support is what pays the salaries of our incredible staff, helps them feed their families, and allows us to keep producing and sharing the very best revenge stories with you. Have a wonderful day, and always remember to stand your ground.